You're listening to the Diplomats podcast on Asian geopolitics. As always, I'm your host, Ankit Panda, back in New York City.
And this is Prashant Parmas. We're in Washington, D.C.
It's good to be back, Prashant. For listeners, I was just traveling for a week, but very much glad to be back in New York so we can tape another episode of the Asia Geopolitics podcast. Prashant, I wanted to actually focus this episode on something that you've been writing a lot about recently, and certainly those of our listeners who pay attention to issues in Southeast Asia, in particular security issues surrounding the South China Sea, will be aware that Indonesia and China ended 2019 and have certainly begun 2020 with a new round of tensions concerning their overlapping waters dispute around Indonesia's Natuna Islands. And this dispute, I think, gets a little bit forgotten in the context of the South China Sea, and it also gets a little bit misunderstood, right? Because it's a little complicated. Indonesia is not actually a territorial claimant in the disputed waters of the South China Sea, but it does dispute its part of its exclusive economic zone, which rises up from the Natuna Islands and trespasses past what China claims with its 9-line claim, which is obviously an ambiguous claim demarcated in dashed lines instead of straight lines. And this dispute's really come to the fore in the past 5 years or so amid wider rising tensions in the South China Sea. But Prashant, you've been writing a lot about this. For our listeners that might be less aware, do you want to just give us an update on what exactly has been going on between the two countries for the last month or so? And maybe you can also tell us a little bit about what the Indonesian government has been doing to cope with the challenges that it's currently seeing from China.
Yeah, so I think you set the scene really well there because this stems from an issue that's pretty complicated historically speaking. Because as you noted, Indonesia is not a claimant in the South China Sea dispute, strictly speaking. And actually, the Indonesian government's been always wanting to be very clear about that. But there is this overlap between China's so-called 9-line and Indonesia's exclusive economic zone. And the Natunas, which is very resource rich, and Indonesia considers not only critical for its security but also its economic development. So this is a major issue. But as we've seen over the past few years, there's been any number of encounters between China and Indonesia and incursions into Indonesian waters perceived by Indonesia by China. So we actually talked on this podcast, for example, back in 2016. March 2016, I think, is the last podcast we did on the sort of Natuna incursion issue, where you actually saw a big rise in tensions between Indonesia and China on the Natuna dispute. And so we saw another round of tensions took place in the last few weeks. Essentially, since December, we've seen Indonesia and China embroiled in a diplomatic spat over the Natunas again, essentially to sort of generalize a little bit, what's been happening is you've seen the trespassing of Chinese vessels into Indonesian waters, and Indonesia has essentially responded through a variety of ways. Militarily, we've seen the deployment of warships and fighter jets that effectively constitute the largest military deployment into the Natunas in decades. I think you'd have to go back to the 1990s to actually see the last time where the Indonesians actually staged major military exercises that actually amounted to this level of escalation or at least a sort of demonstration of its commitment militarily. But also diplomatically, we've seen Jokowi himself also pay a visit to the Natunas and actually, sort of state very clearly that Indonesia is not going to compromise on this issue. This is something he also did back in 2016. And we've seen Indonesia also launch diplomatic protests against China on this issue. The issue really, I think, boils down to, since we're on a geopolitics podcast, really two big questions for me, which we can explore. One is, how much of this is, more of the same with respect to what's going on between Indonesia and China and Indonesia's response, and how much of this is new? And I think, my own sense is, a lot of the things that the Indonesians have been doing, maybe there's a little bit of an escalation here and there, but it's effectively the same response. And this response hasn't really deterred the Chinese before from doing what they're doing. And so I don't think the issues change fundamentally. But I think the second big question for us is, Indonesia is the largest country in Southeast Asia, a very sort of large diplomatic player worldwide. What is Indonesia's role in terms of this big South China Sea issue? Yes, it's not a claimant. But is this going to, help us see maybe Indonesia taking a more assertive role in helping manage these disputes? And I think, unfortunately, I don't see this happening anytime soon. I think Indonesia has always wanted to play a very balanced role, particularly under the Jokowi administration, as we've discussed before. Indonesia wants to preserve its interests and protect its interests, but we haven't really seen Indonesia be involved in a major way diplomatically, getting some other Southeast Asian countries involved, taking a really active role diplomatically on the issue. But maybe I'm being too pessimistic here. I'm not sure what your take is.
No, I think that's right. I mean, I think for Indonesia, this is really about it's a simple issue. It's sovereignty. It's economic sovereignty with the access to the EEZ. We didn't actually define the EEZ, but under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which both Indonesia and China have signed and ratified, a coastal state gets 200 nautical miles of exclusive economic zone where it has the rights to fish and exploit hydrocarbon carbon resources and other things. So by allowing China to kind of assert its own sovereignty here. And by the way, this Chinese playbook is really something that's very familiar to many of the littoral states in the South China Sea, right? Philippines, Vietnam have been experiencing China Coast Guard, Chinese fishing vessels, the so-called maritime militia, asserting Chinese claims by operating further south and further out along the frontiers of the Nine Dash Line claim. The idea being that if Chinese vessels maintain a persistent presence in these areas, China's claim, which of course was invalidated in 2016 by a ruling at the Permanent Court of Arbitration in an international tribunal as being invalid, those claims then stand up. And I think the question over how Indonesia is going to react, Prashant, I mean, I was going to actually ask you that, but you did answer it. I think that's right. I mean, Indonesia's foreign policy, I think, has tended to not make any sharp changes. At least, certainly under Jokowi, there has been the reiteration of certain themes, including the idea of Indonesia as, at least in the first term, as a maritime fulcrum, and the emphasis of maritime sovereignty as one of the world's largest archipelagic states. But broadly speaking, I don't think that this is going to, bring Indonesia sort of into the, quote, Indo-Pacific fold in any big way than it's already been doing. But the question I think, that is the big one is how is Indonesia going to use its weight within ASEAN, where it's sort of long been seen as the first among equals. And as we've discussed on recent podcasts, you do have the Vietnamese in chairing ASEAN, and that, I think, is going to raise the South China Sea issue further up the agenda. I'm curious to hear how you think this might actually feed back into the ASEAN discussion, and also discussions on things like a binding code of conduct potentially.
Yeah, right. I mean, you're right in the sense that this plays into the broader dynamics of the South China Sea. We discussed on our podcast about forecasting some of the key events for this year in terms of flashpoints. And when we talked about the South China Sea, we mentioned there's various reasons why the South China Sea as a flashpoint is going to be a focus this year. You have, as you mentioned, the Vietnamese chairing ASEAN, and also they're a non-permanent member in the United Nations on a rotational basis this year as well. And then you have, some of the events that we saw towards the end of last year, right? Malaysia's new submission on an extended continental shelf. You had this incident with Indonesia. And so it is sort of an interesting question how these dynamics are going to play out. I mean, the other thing that is kind of significant is the time is drawing down on at least the initial timeline for the conclusion of a code of conduct on the South China Sea. Which at least, recently relative to previous times, the Chinese have been very keen on pushing. And so I think one of the interesting questions will be how will China play its cards in terms of trying to continue to coerce as well as test claimants in the South China Sea, as well as non-claimant in terms of Indonesia's case, but then also try to navigate it in terms of the diplomatic path, right? Because, if you're thinking about this from a Southeast Asian claimant state perspective, it would seem to be a little bit incompatible with the fact that China is coercing these countries, but then also asking them to go to the table diplomatically. But I really do think from a Chinese perspective, I don't think that they say these two things separately. I think for Beijing, showing its military might and actually testing and coercing these countries would actually reinforce the fact of what it's doing diplomatically, sort of say, well, listen, if you don't come to us on the table diplomatically and reach a deal on our terms, this is what you're in for. And something that we've discussed on other podcasts before is, it's important to stress the capabilities of these Southeast Asian states are extremely limited. And that includes Indonesia as well. In fact, with the exception of Vietnam, I don't think that the Chinese really sense any significant military capabilities that would actually hinder them from accomplishing what they want in terms of security objectives in the South China Sea.
Yeah, so I mean, when it comes to the North Natuna Sea, I think a lot of maybe not a lot, but a few American analysts at least have been sort of optimistic that this might actually bring Indonesia into
Hmm.
the U.S. fold, and that's very much not been the case. The Indonesians are very content to be at least perceived as managing this situation by themselves. We have seen a different approach from the U.S. State Department, certainly in the last year when we had sort of multiple statements come out condemning China's bullying, particularly against Vietnam over the oil blocks exploration issue with the maritime survey ship last summer. If the United States were to simply take an interest in the situation right now in the North Natuna Sea and begin issuing sort of public condemnations of China as being a bully, do you think that'll? How would that go over in Jakarta? I mean, I think the appearance, at least publicly, might be that the Indonesians might have reached out to the United States, which, as we can tell, is not what's really happening here. But do you think that would be a productive development or something that Jakarta would really be not too keen on at this point?
Yeah, I think that's been something that the Indonesians have been thinking about, quite actively because, I think as you noted in your question, it's been a very difficult dilemma and challenge for Indonesia in the situation. On the one hand, Indonesia historically has always been very wary of major powers, any major power, whether it's, China or the United States, getting involved too much in the region for various reasons. One is, Indonesia considers itself as having its own sort of regional leadership role, and that can get in the way of things. But also this sort of notion that whatever major power is acting in the region, they're going to bring their own interests into the table, and Indonesia's interest is best protected by itself taking an active role relative to other states. But on the other hand, you do see this dynamic over the past few years. We've talked about U.S. South China Sea policy before on the podcast, and essentially what has been happening, particularly post the sort of arbitral tribunal ruling back in 2016, it really was seen as a key moment because we were talking about previous to that, regardless of the ruling, the United States and other countries would essentially either help enforce the ruling or make sure that China obeys by it, and other Southeast Asian countries could come around that. We actually didn't see that after the ruling, and I think Southeast Asian states that were looking at this, those that were expecting a more forward-leaning U.S. response, that was a real teaching moment for them. And you saw other developments like the election of Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte, and the sense that Southeast Asian states would need to take into account what happens in the South China Sea, with the United States playing its role through freedom navigation operations and sort of continuing to challenge, Chinese claims to the extent that they appear for U.S. interests. But we can't really rely on the United States to have a more active and forward-leaning role in the South China Sea in terms of helping us protect our claims. And so I think that has been sort of the mixed picture for Southeast Asian states. I think if you saw the United States take a more active role, there would be concern in the region, but it would also sort of serve as a boost for some of these countries that actually think the reality of the military situation is they can't even together take on China, let alone by themselves. And so this essentially becomes more of a US China contest with its allies and partners rather than something that's just China and Southeast Asian states, which is a very unfair game.
Yeah, so I think you set us up for a nice segue here by talking about a U.S.-China contest because I do want to shift gears a little bit to talk about an interesting argument that was recently made by a friend of the podcast, Gregory Poling, the director of the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative at CSIS, who's commonly cited on all things South China Sea. Greg and his team do a great job of keeping track of a number of things in maritime Asia. But the argument that Greg made in a recent piece headlined "The Conventional Wisdom on China's Island Bases is Dangerously Wrong," published at War on the Rocks on January 10th, is I think something that's worth discussing a little bit. So Greg basically pushes back at this notion that you sometimes hear that China's investments in the 7 artificial islands that it built in the Spratly Group in the South China Sea, including facilities like Mischief Reef on the Philippine continental shelf, Fiery Cross Reef, and Subi Reef, 3 of the biggest facilities there, that these facilities, contrary to the view that they don't have any military utility and would be sort of steamrolled by the United States in a conflict, are actually quite useful for China. And I think that's actually the case that Greg makes, I think, is intuitive and convincing, particularly in terms of how a conflict might escalate and what these islands might actually contribute in the South China Sea. I think this view is starting to catch on a little bit. I mean, one of the things I think has been influencing this debate is that pretty much continuously we've been watching China increase the capability of these islands. So when they were being built, everybody observed airfields that could accommodate really any aircraft in the People's Liberation Army Air Force. So that was an indicator that these would inherently have an important capability as a staging ground for potentially expeditionary fighter operations in and around the South China Sea. But also in recent years, we've seen the deployment of anti-ship cruise missiles, anti-air missiles, both of which will deny freedom of maneuver to U.S. surface warfare vessels and aircraft in the South China Sea. That includes things like P-8 Poseidons, which might be involved in things like submarine hunting, right? We've certainly had many articles at The Diplomat talking about the proliferation of undersea warfare in the South China Sea, not just from the Chinese, but also from other regional states, including notably Vietnam, which has 6 Kilo-class submarines from Russia. All of this is to say, I think that I think it's time for most folks to take these island facilities a little bit more seriously than they do. I mean, the other thing that I talked about a little bit that Greg actually doesn't address in his article, but I think is important is I think there's a pretty good case to be made that China is setting up the South China Sea as a so-called bastion for its ballistic missile submarines. These are the Type 94 submarines that carry the JL-2 nuclear-capable ballistic missile. China doesn't necessarily have the kind of access to open ocean that it would want to have an expeditionary concept of operations for these submarines, something like the U.S. or U.K. continuous at-sea deterrence. Also, China's fairly inexperienced with actually operating an undersea deterrent. But the South China Sea is important here because if you're going to deploy ballistic missile submarines, you're going to want to deny access to U.S. hunter-killer attack submarines or autonomous underwater vehicles from getting into the middle of the South China Sea and potentially tracking your submarines in a conflict, right? The JL-2 actually doesn't have enough range to launch from the South China Sea to reach most U.S. homeland targets, so they would actually have to sail out through the first island chain. And in order to have a good chance of doing that, China would need to exercise pretty good control over the United States' ability to track these vessels in peacetime. So that's just a few thoughts from me on this interesting article from Greg. I'm wondering where you come down on the military value of these facilities. And also tell us a little bit about how Southeast Asian states are thinking about this when it comes to their own military procurement and strategy.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with you that, I'm glad that, Greg wrote this piece and published it because I do think we've seen, a real gap in terms of perceptions between what you hear from military planners in the United States and sort of generalists who don't look at the South China Sea very closely, and those people who look at the South China Sea closely, but then also Southeast Asian states and Southeast Asian governments. And you see, them being a lot more concerned about these facilities and islands than you see the United States and some of the generalists are. And I think part of that is a framing question, and that's why I'm glad that Greg framed this piece in that way. Usually the question is asked very generally, sort of, oh, don't question the U.S. ability to take out these islands, and would these islands really change fundamental military dynamics for the United States? And if you ask the question generally, the answer is always going to be no, irrespective of what the Chinese are doing, until you get to a point where that's not possible. But I think what Greg usefully asks is, the key questions are, first, how difficult would it be for the United States to actually disable these facilities? And then secondly, how would these facilities actually play into, and that's what you were getting at with the other aspects like ballistic missile submarines, how do these facilities actually play into China's broader capabilities? And how would the United States deal with these facilities given all the other requirements that the United States has and given limitations of U.S. capabilities, right? The United States is not a country that is completely invincible, and China's military capabilities are growing as well. And so if you frame it that way, you get to some of the points that Greg makes, which I think are really important. One is the United States could likely take out these facilities, but it's going to actually require a lot of work. And he goes through in a lot of detail, how much work that's going to require, from the amount of ordnance that it would take to actually, if there's a contingency where China is actually threatening on various fronts, the United States may have to divert some of these capabilities from Northeast Asia to actually tackle the South China Sea. So, that's one dimension of this. How difficult would it be? But then the second aspect of this that he raises is also, I mean, how do the Chinese actually think about the utility of these islands? And the fact is, the utility of these islands are not just something that they're thinking about in peacetime. They're actively thinking about this as how they would utilize this in wartime. And it's not just about, their ability to create situational awareness, but it's also, I mean, these are facilities that, as you mentioned, could be used with other Chinese capabilities to actually make China's military capabilities in the South China Sea quite significant. So if you reframe the question that way, I think there's a lot more concern for the United States than if you frame it as a general question of, oh, the United States is very capable militarily, and so we don't have to worry about this.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good note. There's also the issue. I think this is a separate question for a separate podcast, but about how we imagine escalation spreading to the South China Sea. I mean, increasingly in recent years, I've actually come around to, and I don't know, maybe you disagree with this, but I think the likelihood of a U.S.-China conflict beginning in the South China Sea is, I think, lower than the probability of a U.S.-China conflict spreading to the South China Sea, because I still think the main scenario that we should be thinking about is a Taiwan Straits contingency, and how the South China Sea factors into that is, I think, very important. The other issue I'll just say, and maybe this, again, we can talk about on the next podcast that we do about the South China Sea, is why I think coming to the conclusion that these islands are defensible and militarily useful matters for the U.S.-Philippine alliance, right? I mean, for things like continued American investment in EDCA, the operationalization of a regular rotational American presence, potentially even things like the Philippines procuring the BrahMos missile from India, which we've been hearing more and more about in past weeks, why all of those things start to take on an importance in a very different way, depending on your assessment of China's capabilities in the South China Sea. So certainly I think, this is a discussion worth having. And obviously, I mean, to talk a little bit about the work that Greg and his team and other analysts have been doing in the open source, it's very important to track the actual capabilities that China is actually deploying on these facilities, right? In late 2019, for example, we saw China deploy a static aerostat, basically a blimp, a tethered blimp, which might contribute to early warning for things like low-flying cruise missiles. So, for example, if you're worried about something like a American subsonic cruise missile strike on one of your airstrips, like the kind that in 2017 President Trump authorized against Syria, that would be something that you'd deploy to potentially give you early warning, flush out your fighters before those missiles arrive. So I think those kinds of things are something that we should be paying a lot more attention to. I think the specifics very much matter in how we think about the value of these facilities. Anything else to add, Prashant?
I hope what Greg's piece actually stimulates more of a debate, and we actually get some counterpoints from folks who actually think these facilities are actually, and there are cases to be made, right? I mean, we have seen indications that these facilities are still quite vulnerable. Things like resupply are not going to be easy to do. There's been any number of reports about their vulnerability to weather conditions and such, but we shouldn't dismiss entirely their utility. And so if there is a case out there that we shouldn't be as concerned, and that this is military something that the United States would find easier to do, I don't think it's sufficient for the United States and those people who think that is the case to just say, well, we got it, and this is all classified and we're not able to discuss it. I think hopefully we have a more robust discussion as to the points that we've brought up here, right? And that Greg brings up in the piece, which is, I mean, how would the United States respond if this is something which, as you said, is spreading into the South China Sea, and the United States has to deal with things on multiple fronts? And if the Chinese are thinking about this in a wartime situation, with respect to all their other capabilities, how would the United States address the islands as part of that wider scenario, rather than just focusing on the islands themselves, which I think completely misses the point. I don't think anyone is suggesting that China is only using their islands, in a situation with the United States in the South China Sea.
That's right. Yeah, and I think just one more thing is, I think the value of the islands early in a crisis versus later in a crisis, I think, is also worth distinguishing when we talk about these things, right? Because things like logistics and supplies and reloading for surface-to-air and anti-ship missiles, a lot of that doesn't matter early in the crisis when you're ready to go and you've been maintaining these facilities. But yeah, as the crisis proceeds, the value of the islands, I think, quickly depreciates. And I actually, for what it's worth, I do find the environmental and climate change arguments to be a little bit compelling. I mean, there's already been evidence that some of the land reclamation work that China has done has been adversely affected by weather conditions. And, this is a part of the world that does regularly see typhoons. So it'll be interesting to see how this develops over the longer term. But Prashant, I think we'll end it there for today. How does that sound?
Good.
Great. Thanks a lot for joining me. And I'm sure we'll come back to many topics on the South China Sea sooner rather than later, I think. As I just highlighted in my first newsletter, again, if you don't subscribe, you can subscribe to that at diplomat.substack.com. But I talked a bit about the top risks that I think are worth watching in the Asia Pacific in early 2020. And the South China Sea, I think, is steadily rising, right? I think we saw that in the second half of 2019, certainly. For a while, the South China Sea had depreciated in terms of the attention that it was receiving. But I think 2020 is, again, going to be a big year in this region, especially given China's practice of its coercive tactics against multiple claimants and non-claimants alike. So certainly something we'll keep an eye on. So if you like what you heard on the podcast, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you've been a subscriber for a while, please make sure that you leave us a review. It helps other people discover the podcast and really helps us kind of rise in the recommendations for folks. You can leave us a review on Google Play Music, Apple Podcasts, TuneIn, Spotify, any number of other providers. And finally, before we close, a note from our sponsor. This episode of the Asia Geopolitics Podcast is brought to you by Diplomat Risk Intelligence, or DRI. DRI is the consulting and analysis division of The Diplomat, the Asia Pacific's leading current affairs magazine. Since its launch in 2002, The Diplomat has been dedicated to quality analysis and commentary on events and trends in Asia and around the world, and is now one of the most respected publications covering this region. DRI inherits this approach and offers clients in the private, public, and nonprofit sectors worldwide access to an exclusive network of subject matter experts and analysts. Whatever your needs in the wider Asia-Pacific region, DRI can offer the knowledge and expertise necessary to anticipate and manage geopolitical and geoeconomic risk. For more information, please visit dri.thediplomat.com. Thanks a lot for listening, and we'll be back soon with more.